See,
All right, folks. Well, we'll give people just another minute here to hop on, but we're recording it for folks who are not able to be with us. All right. Well, let's go ahead and jump in. Hello. I am really excited to be with you today. For those of you I haven't met yet, I am Lori Leiterbright. I am the still fairly freshly new executive director for the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. I'm a whole, I think, 2 months and 3 weeks now. So really excited to have this opportunity to talk with you, Dr. Long, and to get to know more about your work and for us to have a chance to fill our spirits up a bit. So I want to just invite us, first of all, just a little housekeeping here. This call will last about an hour. We'll have time for questions and answers towards the end, but feel free to drop in the chat as well if questions come up as we go. Please go ahead and make sure you keep yourself on mute until the question and answer time, just so we're sure we don't have interference with the conversation we'll be having. And before we dive in here, I'm hoping we can just take a minute and remember that in whatever our peacemaking work is, however that looks for each of us, we are people. We are people with relationships and with bodies and with needs and with experiences. So I want you to take a minute, please. Put your feet flat on the floor, close your eyes, and breathe. I want to lift up the incredible work of Cole Arthur Riley from her work, Black Liturgies, where she writes, "If you aren't in your body, someone else is.
mm,
The systems of this world have everything to gain from your disembodiment. Stay near to yourself. Listen to your body." I want to invite us to inhale with the phrase, "I resist isolation," and exhale with, "I push back despair." I resist isolation and I push back despair. So this fantastic opportunity to be connected to one another, to learn and grow and deepen our peacemaking work. I want to hand this over to Bruce for introductions and welcome. And thank you, Bruce, for helping to make this whole thing happen. Go ahead, Bruce.
my pleasure, and I'm very grateful to Lori and to the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship because this would not happen without you. Lori, we have many people who are in a waiting room asking to join. Can you
Mhm.
re reconfigure things so they can automatically be part of things, possibly? Because otherwise, we're going to be keep admitting people throughout. So my name is Bruce Gillette. I'm a Presbyterian pastor. I have been a member of the Peace Fellowship since my youth, which was some 40 years ago. And I see a number of people who have joined us who are friends over the decades who have faithfully served the cause of peace and justice and the church's work in that area. And I'm thankful for all who have gathered here, those who are on the way, and also those who will be looking at this recording later. And we'd really encourage folks to share this recording once the Peace Fellowship posts it. It would be, I hope, a wonderful educational tool for use in churches and in communities. It will have a message of an inspiring individual who we need to remember, to celebrate, to learn from. I'm very grateful, if you are a bookaholic like me, to have an opportunity to talk with somebody who you've enjoyed their work. And in this case, we are very blessed to have this wonderful author, scholar, and somebody who has spent many years lifting up the importance of nonviolence, working for peace and justice for all of God's children. And I want to highlight that very briefly, but at some point I would encourage you to go to Amazon and do what I'm about to do and look at the author's page. And let me see, do I have screen sharing privileges? Yes. Okay, here we go. So if you go to Amazon and if you go to Michael G. Long, you will find this page of the author. And right at the top, you'll see some of the ones that are, well, yeah, here we go. On the far left there, the legacy of protest and politics is, I believe, Mike's your most recent book. If I recall, that was just printed this fall in 2023. And this is a superb collection of writings from all kinds of people. Um, some are well known and some maybe less known, but it is an excellent overview of the life and work of this wonderful activist who has helped the movement of peace and justice and change literally this country and the world through his efforts. An older book, maybe 10 years or a little longer, is I Must Resist, a phenomenal collection of his letters from the 1940s to the last year of his life, covering the span. And he was a prolific letter writer, and Mike has put these together. Um, and then you'll notice this one titled Unstoppable. And this is what I think he is working on these days is books not just for adults, but also for young adults and even children. And that's well worth picking up. And the More Than a Dream is a joint effort. As you scroll down, you'll see other books and other topics. The Jackie Robertson, I had a friend in a previous church who was a big fan of his. And to get this book, the subtitle is A Spiritual Biography and talks about Jackie Robertson's faith and how that helped him in his struggles. There's one with Julian Bond, another one on 42. Then on the far right here, I want to lift up The Peaceful Neighbor. Presbyterians will love this one if they don't have it already, on Fred Rogers, and it will surprise you how he was in many ways lifting up the concerns of the day in creative ways to speak to young children through the television. Another one I want to emphasize is Troublemaker for Justice, just a great book for young adults. But then you'll see on the left side here, Gay is Good, and he edited that. And this is some of Mike's more recent work looking at issues of the struggles of gay, lesbian, and the whole diverse community. Just scroll down, you'll see many, many excellent books by this gifted author. And again, check him out on Amazon, but I'd encourage you to look at your local bookstore or maybe another independent bookstore like Hearts and Minds. You don't have to buy them at Amazon, but you can at least see the excerpts on Amazon. So, Mike, let's talk about how you got into this. You have been writing for a number of years. For a number of years, you also were a college professor. What brought you to explore this unique individual, somebody who too often was in the shadows, but folks who knew about the civil rights movement felt he couldn't be ignored, but there haven't been that many books about him. In the last year, a lot more people are paying attention to him because there's a new film based on part of his life, and that is now available on Netflix. Our local church here in rural New York is going to show it for Martin Luther King Day on Monday. And you and I have talked about the movie, and we can talk a little bit further, but I think more people are trying to learn about him. I would encourage everyone here to pick up several of your books, not only for their personal reading, but consider donating them to your church library, to your public library. If you have a college or high school in your community that you think would make use of them, let's be book evangelists for the cause of nonviolence by sharing Mike's books with many people. But Mike, how did you first get involved and interested in this remarkable man?
Hey, Bruce. Good chatting with you, and thanks to Laurie and the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship and all of you out there. Feel free to call me Mike, by the way. My interest in Rustin really emerged organically. I was doing some work on Thurgood Marshall and Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. And it's impossible to look at either of those figures really without coming across the name of Bayard Rustin. For example, if you look at Dr. King's life, you'll learn that in 1960, um, he was planning to protest the Democratic National Convention and the Republican National Convention. And Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who represented Harlem at that point, a member of Congress, didn't want King and the others to march on the Democratic National Convention. And so he called King through an intermediary with this threat: if you don't call off the march on the Democrats, I'll go to the media and tell them that you're having a gay affair, a sexual affair with Bayard Rustin. It wasn't true. But Dr. King, in this homophobic society, freaks out. He panics. And he cuts Rustin out of his inner circle in a moment of horrific bigotry and prejudice. And Rustin is absolutely crushed. So I came across this story as well as other stories about Rustin in my works on other people. And so I started to dig around a little bit and discovered that Rustin has his papers deposited at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. I went down there, I looked at his papers. I went to Swarthmore College, to the Peace Collection there, and dug around a bit. And I discovered that Rustin brings together so many of my interests. He brings together democratic socialism, pacifism, nonviolence, economic justice, racial equality, and certainly LGBTQ rights as well. And so I was really interested in this convergence of social justice issues in this one particular person, interests that overlap with mine. And that really got me started in Rustin's life. And then I went to Walter Nagel, who for the last 10 years of Rustin's life was his companion. And I asked Walter for permission to work on some of the Rustin projects that I took up through the years.
I think for folks who are not familiar with the story, let's go back. I think that King and Rustin first got together at Montgomery, and Rustin had a pivotal role in helping King use the strategy of nonviolence. For example, if I remember correctly, early on in that protest, King had armed guards, and Rustin was saying, "Okay, we need to really do a nonviolent witness," and that was at real risk. There were bombings, there were shootings, there was all kinds of things going on. He had been trained. This was his area of expertise in the 50s, and he brought it to this young pastor in Montgomery. Could you share a little bit about how they got together? And that went on until, into the 60s. And Rustin, throughout King's life, had very influential roles beyond the March on Washington. But share a little bit more at the beginning, how they got together and worked on nonviolence.
Sure. Rustin at the time was working for the War Resisters League in New York, and he was in touch with A.J. Musty of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, A. Philip Randolph, and some other leaders in New York who were very concerned that the bus boycott would turn violent. There were rumors that people were sending guns to Montgomery, and that the bus boycott there would become a horrific example of bloodshed, directed primarily against Black people. And so they talked with Rustin, and Rustin said that he wanted to go down and do what he could. And Rustin made the trip to Montgomery. When he first got there, you're right, he discovered that there were armed bodyguards outside of King's home. He went into King's home and discovered there were also weapons in King's home. King wasn't there at the time, but he met with Coretta. He came back and he started discussions with King about the importance of not only being nonviolent, not only embracing the tactic of nonviolence, but also being a pacifist, somebody who's committed to peace as a way of life. And so Rustin really urged King to adopt not only nonviolence, but also pacifism. Rustin wasn't alone in that, but he certainly was a major player in influencing King on this point. Following the Montgomery boycott, Rustin played a really key role in creating the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957, which was the main civil rights organization that King led from 57 to 1968. Rustin wrote speeches for King. He wrote articles for King. He was a close advisor to King way up until that 1960 incident that I mentioned early on. There were conflicts that they had along the way, and we can talk about that later. But, King looked to Rustin in some ways as a mentor in civil rights and in issues of peace and nonviolence. And what Rustin saw in King was somebody who was charismatic and who could bring disparate groups of people together to fight for racial equality and economic justice. I mean, both King and Rustin were charismatic figures, no doubt about it. But Rustin saw in King a charism that he didn't have. And in some ways, he wanted to elevate King to a national stage in order to advance civil rights in the United States.
Somebody put in the chat that nonviolence is more than a strategy, but a way of life, that this is a holistic approach to how we interact with folks. And I think Rustin would very much agree with that. And he paid a personal cost for that throughout his life. And in some ways, because of his deep level of faithfulness and living the life of nonviolence, for example, maybe you could talk a little bit about, I remember reading in your book his letter to the draft board. And maybe you could explain, in the 1940s, when many people saw World War II as a good war, that could not be the case for Rustin. And maybe you could share a little bit about that. The Peace Fellowship started in the 1940s to support COs, and so this part of our history is very important to us. So if you could share a bit more about him being a CO and the reasons he gave, which were not only religious, but also critique of the racism and the segregation in the military. Could you share a little bit about that?
Sure. I'll go to the comment in the chat and just make a distinction that Rustin made, just to clarify things a little bit. Rustin believed that you could be nonviolent while not being a pacifist. He recognized that a lot of the people that he and King were trying to get into the movement were not pacifists and probably wouldn't be the rest of their lives. And so he recognized that, but he trained them in nonviolence and a nonviolent strategy. Rustin saw nonviolence as a strategy and a tactic. He saw pacifism as a way of life that embraced nonviolence, but he also recognized that people could embrace nonviolence while still not being pacifists. And that was one of the struggles in the movement, because when you get people in your nonviolent campaigns who aren't pacifists, sometimes they just might fly off the handle. And that happened at points. Now, let me talk a little bit, Bruce, about the CO status that Rustin claimed. You're right. World War II was a difficult time, I believe, for pacifists. It was considered to be the good war. Why? Because you're fighting Hitler and Nazism and anti-Semitism and so forth. Rustin wrote a letter to his draft board, and he claimed CO status, conscientious objector status. Later, he left that status behind because he did not want to participate in the war effort in any way. And so if you declared yourself as a conscientious objector in World War II, you could go serve as a medic. You could also do what's called works of national importance through work camps that were run by the government. Actually, they were mostly run by the Quaker organization, but that's another story. Rustin didn't want to go to a work camp, and he didn't want to be a medic. He didn't want to do anything to support the war effort. And so he left his conscientious objector status behind and just refused to report to the medical board when he was supposed to be drafted. And because he refused to be inducted, he was jailed. He was given a sentence of 3 years. He served a big part of that. But yes, early on, he claimed CO status. His reasons were primarily religious at this point. And he said basically that following Jesus means that I'm not able not only to not kill anybody, but not to support the war effort at all. And at this point, he's telling his local meeting house that they shouldn't even provide uh, social support for the soldiers, which is pretty radical. Don't make sandwiches for the soldiers, don't make clothes for them, don't host dances for them, and so forth. Don't do anything to support the war effort. I mean, Rustin was a radical pacifist in World War II.
And he was willing to pay the cost. He was very public about it. He wrote the letter to the draft board. He also wrote to the law enforcement folks saying, this is what I'm doing. And he ended up he could have done alternative service, but he didn't. He really felt that's what he needed to do.
It's one of the few places where Rustin writes about Jesus explicitly in his work. You don't see it a whole lot. Rustin was a Quaker. I became a Quaker after he moved to New York in 1938. But I'll tell you that he was reared in a household run by his grandmother and his grandfather. They basically adopted him as their own and reared him. And his grandmother, Julia, was reared in a Quaker household, and she was schooled in Quaker beliefs. And Rustin's grandfather was a member of the AME church. And so he has these really two interesting religious strands coming together in his life. From his grandmother, he learns about the inner light, and he adopts what's called the Quaker spices, right? Equality, the unity of the human family, peace. And from his grandfather's side, from the AME side, he's hearing the story of Moses and the Exodus time and again, right? So he takes those Quaker spices and he applies them liberally to the lessons that he's learning from the AMEs, and he devotes his life to fighting for the liberation of enslaved people in ways that give recognition to their equality, to their dignity, and to the peaceable kingdom or the reign that we all should live in. I mean, it's a beautiful synthesis of a life.
And I would say the grandmother had an incredible role in his life. She was very influential. Again, another letter. When he is in the federal prison, it's hard for him, it's hard for his family, like it often is for people that are in prison. And there is this beautiful letter where he asks his grandmother on a particular day, at a particular time, let's both read a particular psalm and find comfort that we're reading these scriptures together, listening to it, and also across the bars, across the prison, across the distance, are very much in solidarity with one another. It's a very moving account. Lori, I don't want to ask all the questions. I'm sure you've got a few.
I do. Yeah. I'm wondering if we could just jump back to Mike talking about how he intersects with other figures in the civil rights movement. So, certainly the Dr. King connection is the most prominent one to most of our minds, but he obviously intersected in lots of other ways. So I'm wondering if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Sure. One of the more troubling intersections, I believe, happened during the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. There was one woman who was a member of the administrative committee for that march. Her name was Anna Arnold Hedgeman, and she was a huge figure in the civil rights movement. She had worked with A. Philip Randolph, the great Black labor leader in the 1940s, and he had tapped her to work on administration for the march. I mean, she was a force to be reckoned with. She was a Black woman, and she was also a member of the National Council of Churches, and she did recruiting work for the National Council of Churches for the march as well. In fact, Anna Arnold Hedgeman is really responsible for turning out probably 20 to 30,000 marchers, no kidding, at the march. She was upset during the planning stage for the march because she believed that women, Black women, should have a speaking role during the main program for the march. And she advocated for Dorothy Height, who was another Black civil rights leader at this point, and some other women as well. Her views were shut down. They were shut down by Rustin. They were shut down by A. Philip Randolph and other leaders of the Big Six and then the Big Ten, which included 4 white leaders as well. She keeps fighting for the inclusion of women during the main program of the march. And Rustin basically says something like, well, we have Mahalia Jackson. And Mahalia Jackson sang some beautiful spirituals that day, moving the crowd to heights unseen. And Arnold Hedgeman says, that's great. She's singing, but we want to speak. And again, she's shut down. And I think Rustin says something like, well, if we pick one, the other women will be jealous. That's sort of an indirect quote. And Hedgeman's furious. Eventually, she wins inclusion by agreeing to a plan to have a woman, in this case, Daisy Bates from Little Rock, Arkansas, who was part of the Arkansas school crisis down there in 1957, recognize several Negro heroines who were part of the civil rights movement. Daisy Bates gave a speech that day. It was written by a white man. And she did recognize the heroines. Some of them weren't present. One of them wasn't present because she didn't know it was going to happen. It was a rather haphazard affair. I say all of this to highlight that women struggled to have a prominent place in the civil rights movement. And I don't think Rustin and Randolph and some of the others really helped a lot at this point. Now, I will emphasize as well that Ella Baker was a magnificent player in the civil rights movement, and she and Rustin had worked together in 1957 to create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that again, the main civil rights organization that King led from 57 to 68. And she played a key role in registering voters and so forth. But Ella Baker was never really elevated to the status of other leaders. But she and Rustin did work closely, and Rustin had enormous respect for her. But he had a mixed record, I believe, in his intersections with Black women leaders of the civil rights movement.
Mike, I remember reading the report on the March on Washington. When you talk about sexism, they wouldn't even let the women come into the prominent places. The men all had to come in, and then the women were brought in separately, right? I mean, the optics were not good.
Well, there was an idea that the women leaders should march on Independence Avenue, and that the male leaders should march on Constitution Avenue. Constitution Avenue is the bigger avenue of the two, and Independence is sort of off to the left as you're going down into the Lincoln Memorial, into the Lincoln Memorial. And some women went over there. It didn't really play out that way, but that was the plan, to segregate the women from the men in terms of the march. It was a crazy idea that didn't work out.
There were 2 key people, I think, in Rustin's life, Randolph and Muskie. It seems like in his letters and that those 2 were highly influential. Could you say a bit more about both of them and their role in Rustin's life? Yeah, the
Sure.
labor leader and also the FOR leader.
Right. Let me talk about A. Philip Randolph. He was the founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which at time was the largest union of Black laborers in the United States. He founded that union. He was a democratic socialist to the bone. He believed that the government had an obligation to steer the economy in a way that put people over profits. Rustin was attracted to that idea. He was attracted to Randolph's organizing abilities And he and Randolph worked on various campaigns throughout the years, including the first March on Washington that didn't happen. It was a 1941 March on Washington for Jobs. It was organized by Rustin and Randolph and others who wanted to desegregate national defense industries. It didn't happen because Roosevelt caved when he heard or believed that 100,000 Black men were about to march on Washington. He didn't like that idea, so he desegregated, or at least he gave an order to desegregate the national defense industries. After that, Randolph and Rustin worked together on desegregating the armed forces. And in 1957, they worked together on the prayer pilgrimage, which is another march on Washington that really lifted King onto the national stage. And when he gave this great speech saying, "Give us the ballot," and A. Philip Randolph was there. So he and Rustin had a really close working relationship. Randolph was Rustin's mentor. Randolph really was the one who held Rustin close, even when those threats came against Rustin for his being gay. Nobody stood by Rustin more strongly than A. Philip Randolph did. Musty, A.J.E. Musty of the Fellowship of Reconciliation did not do that. In 1953, Rustin was working with the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He was traveling the country, speaking about world peace. He ends up in Pasadena, partly sponsored by the Quakers there, and he gives a speech on world peace. Later that night, he goes out, he cruises around a little bit, and he gets arrested in a car with two white men, and they're all arrested for having engaged in lewd vagrancy. Musty at the Fellowship of Reconciliation learns about this. He knew that Rustin was gay. He knew that Rustin had been arrested before, and this time he loses his cool, and Rustin resigns from the FOR. And that's to great pleasure of A.J. Musty and others in FOR. Nevertheless, A.J. Musty is really the one who brought Rustin into the peacemaking circles of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He sent him to be a trainer throughout the United States, and they were good friends up to that point.
Did they reconcile after that or not?
Uh, they weren't ever as close as they were before 1953. In fact, Musty opposed Rustin becoming the head of the War Resisters League after he was arrested and then spent some time in jail for lewd vagrancy.
Okay.
You-
King, go ahead. I'm sorry, Lloyd, go ahead.
Okay, I was just gonna ask, I mean, you kind of touched on this a little bit, that it really sounds like Rustin was something of a total anomaly of being so radically committed to nonviolence and pacifism and gay and Black and Christian and all of these intersecting ways of being in the world. Did he have peers who could share in those characteristics and spaces with him, or was he fairly isolated?
I think he was fairly isolated as somebody who brought all of those characteristics together. He did certainly have partners and lovers through the years. He certainly traveled in socialist circles and in pacifist circles, but he was really a unique being in many ways. I mean, Laura, you can see why I was so attracted to him.
Absolutely.
There's this huge convergence of all these issues in one person, and he's not only enacting them, he's embodying them. You know, he's not wearing his sexuality on his sleeve. He's of that generation that considered his sexual orientation to be a private affair. And so he doesn't join the Madison societies, which were early homophile organizations that fought for gay and lesbian rights in the 50s and 60s. He doesn't join those. He doesn't join the Stonewall Uprising and the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activist Alliance that come out of the Stonewall Uprising. So he's not part of that movement, but he's supportive of those rights, of course. But I wish I could, if I could ask him anything, I wish I could ask him, why didn't you ever become part of those movements? It seems like a natural fit for you. Those movements were largely white, they were largely middle class, they were largely upper class. So in some ways, he didn't fit with them demographically, but I think that he was devoted to racial justice above all other issues of justice, racial and economic justice above all other issues.
Thank
I
you.
do think it's important to recognize the economic justice advocacy of his work. He was more than just for nonviolence, for peace, but very much for economic justice. And part of that was Randolph's influence, but part of it just is wanting every human being to have the basic rights. And we sometimes forget the March on Washington lifted up jobs, lifted up economic justice. Um, and he was advocating in that pilgrimage for peace for King to include that in his speech. When King gave his Nobel Prize speech in Oslo, Rustin was there and also wanting it to be an inclusive kind of speech. Can you say more about that,
Sure.
Mike?
I can tell you that Rustin was a communist in the late 1930s. He joined the Young Communist League. He did partly as a way to fight for racial justice because the YCL at that point was one of the few organizations fighting openly for racial justice in New York City. He was attracted to the YCL not only because of that, but also because of economic justice concerns. He became disenchanted with them when they started to stand behind Russia at the expense of fighting for racial justice, I believe. He switched his allegiances to democratic socialism, and he and Randolph fought for democratic socialism together. You're right. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom delivered a sharp critique of American capitalism. It's probably the first critique of US capitalism that millions of people heard for the first time ever in their lives. They tuned in that day. Philip Randolph, I think, gave probably the most powerful speech that day in terms of substance. He delivered a sharp critique of capitalism, and he called for a government-steered economy that put people over profits. He and Rustin were on the same page about that. In fact, Rustin had asked people at the march to go home directly after the march. He didn't want people sticking around. He thought there might be troubles and so forth. So he instructed people once they were done marching to go home. He stuck around and had attended a conference on democratic socialism that was held in the area. His his closest assistant was a young man named Tom Kahn, and Tom Kahn was a democratic socialist as well. The director of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom of Transportation was a democratic socialist as well, and so were other figures who were close assistants to Rustin. So he really steered that march to focus on economic justice. After the march, I will say that he became the head of the A. Philip Randolph Institute. He developed something called the Freedom Budget for All Americans. And if enacted, this budget would have enacted democratic socialist principles in US policy. It never really happened because Johnson was so focused on executing the Vietnam War that his plans for the war on poverty really collapsed. And so did Rustin's dream of a democratic socialist American economy.
Lori,
Uh, yeah, I mean, I think we could go on for a while here with more questions, but I also want to make sure we leave plenty of space for folks to get their questions in here. So, Bruce, did you have a final question you wanted to ask, or should we turn it?
we are coming up on Martin Luther King Day, and in the last, I think, year of his life, King's national holiday was instituted, and in that wonderful edited collection that you put together, Mike, there is a letter that he wrote just days after that first national holiday. And Rustin points out that Martin King would not be who he was and remembered the way he was without the work of a lot of other people. And he wasn't taking anything away from King. He recognized King's gifts and King's contribution and his sacrifice, but he also said, this should be remembered not only as King's Holiday, but many other people. He also, and you contributed to a book on the sort of domestication of King. And in the closing line of this letter to a labor leader, he talks about he doesn't want young people to idolize King as much as to emulate him, to truly enact and live out what King was trying to do. Could you say a little bit more about that, possibly?
Well, I think you summed it up really well there, Bruce. I don't know if I'll add anything to that, but I'll say that the same is true of Rustin. If you watch the movie Rustin, you might fall into the trap of freezing Rustin at the March on Washington. That's what we've done with Dr. King, right? We like to freeze our heroes at a particular moment in history. We freeze Jackie Robinson in 1947 when he shatters the color barrier. We freeze Rosa Parks in 1955 when she refuses to surrender her seat. We freeze Dr. King when he gives his I Have a Dream speech. And my fear is that we'll freeze Bayard Rustin at the March on Washington. The problem with that, especially if we stick to that Hollywood script version, is that we will lose the radical Rustin, that radical Rustin who was focused not only on teaching the philosophy of nonviolence and teaching the philosophy of pacifism and teaching the philosophy of democratic socialism, but getting out there and working every day to enact those principles in our daily lives. I mean, Rustin was a person of action. He could have fallen into despair. In fact, he writes about this in one of his letters to a woman who's fighting anti-Semitism, as you know, Bruce, and is despairing because it just keeps coming at her and coming at her. And Rustin basically says something like, "Look, I've been in bombed out churches. I've been fighting my whole life for racial justice, and now here comes Nixon, and he's knocking us all back. I will not surrender, though. I take hope in a better future, and I will get up there. I will stand up every day and continue to work for justice and dignity." That's who Rustin was. He was somebody who was deep in thought, but deeper in action.
Thank you. Lori, why don't we open it up for people who have joined us for their questions or comments? There have been some good insights that have been put on in the chat, and I encourage folks to try to listen, but also maybe do a little reading from the chat at the same time. Lori, is there one you'd like
Yeah.
to?
Yeah, I'd just like to lift up the question about addressing Rustin's insights on moving from protest to negotiation, of pursuing the goal of reconciliation as a new relationship of mutual respect and more fair relational structures, seeking the common good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll talk about Rustin's shift from protest to politics, and then I'll talk a little bit about reconciliation and criminal justice, if I may. So in 1964, Rustin, with the help of Tom Kahn, his young assistant, draft this famous essay, famous, if you know Rustin, it is, called From Protest to Politics. And what Rustin calls for at this point is shifting the focus from street protests to the corridors of power so that those who are active on the streets can begin to rub shoulders with those who exercise power, who have the resources to transform society in terms of money and people, and to do so by realigning the Democratic Party. What Rustin and Kahn and others wanted to do was to toss out the conservative elements, especially the Southern Dixiecrats, who were opposed to racial justice. He wanted the people who were fighting on the streets to enter the corridors of power, throw the Dixiecrats out, and basically take over the Democratic power, build further power by establishing voters across the country, and then using the resources of the country in order to advance economic and racial justice. So he has this really interesting vision of moving from streets to the corridors of power. Never happens, unfortunately, but that's his vision. He also has this vision early on when he's on a chain gang, believe it or not, after being part of this journey called the Journey of Reconciliation in 1947. And this was a journey that preceded the freedom rides of 60 and 61. And on this journey, members of CORE, the Commission on Racial Equality, went through the Upper South, testing the Supreme Court's decision that criminalized racial segregation on interstate transportation, interstate transportation. And as they tested that, Rustin got arrested along the way, and he had to serve time in a chain gang in North Carolina. And as he did so, he writes about his time there. And in those writings, he talks about the need to not only do away with chain gangs, but to establish reconciliation between the jailers and those who are jailed. It's a really interesting piece that I can't go into. I'll simply refer you to the book, Bayard Rustin, Legacy of Protest and Politics. It's covered in there. But in those writings about being on the chain gang, he talks about the need for reconciliation within the criminal justice system. It's really powerful stuff. It precedes so much of the reconciliation work that we saw in the 80s and 90s, especially.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Mhm.
That. Are there other questions folks would like to ask? You can go ahead and raise a hand or unmute yourself or put it in the chat.
You know, I see Joan Baez is mentioned here, and I'll simply mention along with that reference that Baez performed in the preliminary part of the program for the March on Washington. The March on Washington had different programs. There was the march, the formal part that happened at the Lincoln Memorial. There was a preliminary program at the Lincoln Memorial. Then there was a preliminary to the preliminary program that happened at the Washington Monument. And Joan Baez sang at the Washington Monument, and then she sang during the preliminary program at the Lincoln Memorial. During the march itself, this is what I want to highlight because we lose it so much in our contemporary protests. During the March on Washington, there was a program that blended speeches and prayers and meditations and spirituals and other types of music. It was, in some ways, a religious experience.
Revival.
Rustin put that together. And at different parts of that program, you can see people waving their hands. You can see them weeping. Some people fall to their knees. I watched the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington, and I listened to all 50 plus speakers that day. There wasn't the blend that the original 1963 March had. It didn't blend in spirituals. It didn't blend in music. It didn't blend in meditations. I wish we would bring that back. Rustin had a sense that during protests, we want to appeal to people's minds, but we also want to appeal to their hearts. We know that people move their feet best when their hearts are affected and when their minds are affected. I wish our current day protests would bring that back.
That incarnation of it, right?
Absolutely.
The things that
Yeah.
get you moving. Yeah, absolutely. Other questions folks would like to ask?
I can tell you that though he wasn't part of the LGBTQ movement as it was forming in the Madison societies of the 50s and 60s, and then at Stonewall and the Gay Liberation Front, he did become active later in his life, and that's primarily because his companion, Walter Nagel, nudged him along the way. Walter was Rustin's administrative assistant, and he would put invitations from LGBTQ organizations in front of Bayard, and he would say, you might want to check these out. And indeed, Rustin became active. He spoke to LGBTQ organizations later in his life. He advocated for anti-discrimination laws, anti-discrimination against LGBTQ laws in New York City, and he became outspoken about the issue. And I think he did that largely because of Walter.
So
Oh,
you've
that's interesting. I didn't realize that he was supposed to speak at the 1987 LGBT March on Washington. Oh, thank you for that nugget. I'll have to check into the papers there and see what kind of evidence we have, whether he wrote back or whether they asked him to speak on anything in particular. It doesn't surprise me that he was asked to speak that. Oh, it's in Brother Outsider. Brother Outsider is a great documentary about Rustin. In fact, if you see the march and if you see the Rustin film, if you don't see the Rustin film, watch that documentary, Brother Outsider. It fills in so many wonderful details about Rustin's life, including his early years in Westchester, Pennsylvania.
very cool. Thank you.
Whether it's Helen or Helene, I'm not sure, but you're full of so much information. Thank you so much for your little nuggets along
Oh,
the
the line is mispronounced.
Nice, thank you.
Excellent.
And I'm just wondering, Mike, if you could pick what Rustin's legacy would look like, right? If this, there's so much attention right now around the film and energy kind of building, what would you pick for that legacy to be?
Well, his legacy is unfulfilled. And in many ways, those of us who are here today are his legacy. People who are interested in his life and embodying and enacting much of what he believed. I think if we saw his legacy in terms of policy, we would see an economy that reflected democratic socialist principles, perhaps more on the line of some of the Scandinavian economies that we saw emerge. I think in some ways we'd be more like Denmark, whose happiness quotient is much higher than ours and much higher than other countries because it puts its people above profits in many ways. I think that our criminal justice would focus less on imprisoning people and more on reconciliation. I think in terms of policy, we would see more attention to education that favors teaching racial justice rather than banning books about racial justice. I think we would see more attention to passing anti-discrimination laws. We still don't have a federal law that bans discrimination against LGBTQ people, which just baffles me. So in terms of policy, I think we would see those in relation to Rustin's legacy in our daily lives. I think we would see us maintaining friendships with people we disagree with. Rustin and Malcolm X had fundamentally opposed policies. Malcolm X at certain points favored rifle clubs for self-defense. At certain points, he favored Black separatism and building a separate Black state. This was early on in his life. He changed some of those beliefs later on. But Rustin remained friends with Malcolm X. He respected Malcolm X deeply. He debated Malcolm X at Howard University. He disagreed with him thoroughly and told him as much. And I love that about Rustin. I love that about Malcolm X. They were very honest with each other. This isn't a good image, but they didn't pull their punches, so to speak. What's really interesting about Rustin too is that he allowed himself to change his mind through the years, to evolve, to develop, to change in different ways that some of us might not consider evolution. I think that he remained personally committed to pacifism. I think later in his life, he questioned whether he should have been a pacifist during World War II, given what he knew about the enormity of the violence perpetrated against Jewish people. Later in his life, he called for sending military jets to Israel, by the way, because he thought that Israel was one of the most oppressed nations on earth and had a right to defend itself. So he really changed his beliefs in some striking ways and some shocking ways. And it's good for us to remember that. as well. He was opposed to starting African American studies in colleges and universities. He feared that those studies would become further alienated from integrating Black history into US history classes. So Rustin was a really complicated figure, and I think that his life calls on us to make sure that we treat people fairly, that we don't treat them as one-dimensional, that we dig into their lives with all their complexity, all their complications, and embrace them at the same time as friends.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for your
Sure.
time. Yeah, Bruce, go ahead.
There are reports about threats of violence with the upcoming election. We have seen all kinds of threats against state capitals. One presidential candidate is saying there's going to be bedlam if he doesn't win. How do you think Rustin would respond to the violent threats and actual violence in our society today in relation to elections? And here's a man who was working so hard for peaceful changes, and we're seeing forces today that are trying to use violence or the threats of violence to accomplish things that are.
Yeah. In the United States, Rustin was opposed to using violence to advance civil rights agendas. So while I don't want to say what he would say today, I can tell you that he opposed violence to support civil rights. He understood the Harlem riots of 1964, Harlem uprisings. He understood the Watts riots of 1965. He and Dr. King went to Watts. By the way, Billy Graham flew above Watts in 1965 after the riots and said that the real problem was within the hearts of people and they needed to give their lives to Jesus. Now, he supplemented that later by calling for better economic policies, more jobs, and so forth. But Dr. King and Rustin, they traveled on the ground. They mixed with the people in Watts and Harlem, Rustin and Harlem. He understood that that violence was a cry of despair. People weren't listening to the residents of Harlem and the residents of Watts. At the same time, he denounced the violence. He never stopped denouncing the violence in riots and uprisings. But he didn't emphasize that. What he emphasized was the need for policymakers to change the lives of those who are crying out for justice. It's different, Bruce, from what you're talking about, but it's good to keep in mind when we think about violence today.
Yeah, where are our opportunities to live into our nonviolent stances and where are
Right.
our opportunities to radically humanize each other, even when it's really, really difficult to do so. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for your time, for your presence with us and all of your work. It's, yeah, it is inspiring and we're just so grateful to have had this time with you. So thank you all for being here and being part of this. And I will put back up here the little information about all the upcoming events we have coming for the Peace Fellowship because we've got lots going on. But in the meantime, blessings on your day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Laurie.
Well, I'm not quick enough here.
Well, I'll say again, buy his books and share his books with others, with libraries. Not only study his teachings and live them out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, and we've got the next group ready to start doing piecework. So we're going to jump off here, but thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.